Congratulations, you've made it to the final week of this class. In this lecture, we'll cover a few topics related to employee health and safety. Let's begin with a summary of how we can promote a safer work environment. We need to make sure that managers and top leaders are committed to a safer work environment. We also need to review the current situation. What are the current standards, the current policies, the current rewards and punishments for inappropriate behavior? We should conduct periodic inspections of the work environment to establish whether or not we are meeting these standards. We should identify potential hazards in the work environment, and we should identify employees who are at risk for accidents, injuries. Only then should we start to make any changes. We would want to, of course, conduct a needs analysis in terms of training to identify any programs or development opportunities that might help people improve their safety behaviors at work. These preventative programs would then be designed following the steps that we talked about in previous lectures. Finally, we need to monitor the results of our changes of our new training programs and potentially go right back up to that first step and make sure that any new managers, any new leaders understand the importance of the safety culture and continue down the line with those steps again. In 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed. It applies to all U.S. employers. As part of the act, an administration was created within the U.S. Department of Labor in 1971. We refer to this administration as OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA's main goal is to reduce the number of work-related injuries, illnesses, accidents, and deaths. This arm of the federal government has the ability to impose fines of up to $70,000 for violations of the act. OSHA has two main responsibilities: develop and enforce safety standards and conduct inspections using one of their 1,100 inspectors. They also provide consultation services where they help employers make sure that they are following the law. They provide training assistance and recognition programs. When it comes to developing standards, these standards, of course, need to be enforceable because OSHA is the arm that will enforce them. These standards should be specific and stipulate the kinds of policies and practices that employers should use to ensure that the work environment is safe and secure. The General Duty Clause covers aspects of the work environment that are not covered by OSHA's standards. This clause basically says that employers will do what it takes to make sure that the work environment is safe and that their employees are well taken care of. OSHA then inspects work environments to ensure compliance. Sometimes these inspections are random, sometimes they are a result of an employee complaint. Whatever the reason, OSHA either has to have a reason for the inspection, or if they don't have a reason, they have to have the employer's consent. OSHA cannot just walk onto a property and inspect it because they want to. They either have to have a reason or they have to have the employer's consent. OSHA is also responsible for defining some important terms. An occupational injury is any injury that results from a work-related accident or from exposure to some environmental factor in a single incident. If there are multiple incidents, if someone is exposed to some type of hazardous chemical, for instance, over a long period of time, then we might refer to the resulting symptoms as an occupational illness. At the bottom of this slide, you can see several examples of occupational injuries and illnesses. Things like distracted driving, excessive noise, and lower back injuries afflict millions of Americans every single year and cost them and the health industry billions of dollars in terms of copays, medical payments, medical treatments, and lost productivity. Repetitive strain injuries are a specific type of occupational injury that occurs when we make the same physical movement over and over again repetitively. This repetition can sometimes be hard on our bodies, on our muscles, on our joints, on our bones even. This type of injury is covered under the General Duty Clause. Employers are supposed to do what they can to prevent and minimize this type of injury. Thankfully, there's a whole field dedicated to improving the design of the work environment so that it's more compatible with the human body, both physically and psychologically. In the image, you see an example of how the work desk should be set up to minimize the strain on our bodies. Things like making sure that your feet are flat on the floor, making sure that your eyes are looking straight ahead, not up or down. These strategies come from the field of ergonomics, sometimes referred to as human factors or engineering psychology. On the next few slides, I want to cover some of the ways that we might reduce workplace accidents. In this figure, we have some of the principles of a total safety culture, a culture that encourages employees to be safe and to take care of their health. First of all, safety should be driven internally, not externally. We don't want to wait until something bad happens or wait until OSHA comes knocking at our door to begin shaping a culture to be more safety conscious. We want to do it on our own, voluntarily, and be proactive about encouraging safety behaviors. In order to change people's behaviors, we need them to not only understand what they're supposed to be doing, but why they're supposed to be doing it. We want to make sure that we are paying attention to things in the environment, that we're paying attention to behaviors, and that we're considering factors in the individual, things like motivation and skill level. Don't assume that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing in terms of safety. Sometimes what you think is common sense is something that needs to be learned by another person. So be explicit in your expectations. Never assume that people already know that. It's important that incentive programs focus on the process, the behaviors used to reach safety outcomes. If you focus too much on the outcomes, people will use whatever behaviors are necessary to get that outcome instead of using the behaviors you want them to use. Remember that observational learning is a big part of workplace learning. We learn from watching other people. If we watch someone else violate a safety regulation, we are more likely to violate that safety regulation. So we have to make sure that everyone is working together to be role models for one another. Consider on-the-job observations and immediate constructive feedback as ways of shaping employee behavior. Provide reminders for safety behaviors. Make sure you hold people accountable for unsafe behaviors. One of the things that happens is when employees perceive the work environment to be safe, they sometimes end up taking more risks. When it comes to minimizing job stress, which we'll cover in the second half of this lecture, we need to make sure that people feel like they have control over their job, over their personal life, and the balance between the two. The more control people perceive, generally, the less job stress they experience. Related to that is the idea that when people feel empowered, when they feel like not only do they have control, but they're also able to make decisions and provide input and maintain a balance between work and non-work, When people feel empowered, they tend to exhibit safety behaviors, and those behaviors then spread to other people. And finally, when we're trying to evaluate a safety program, we need to make sure that we share data from the evaluation of that program, its objectives, its goals, its results. We need to make sure that that information is then fed back to employees. It needs to be understandable, it needs to be digestible, and it needs to make sense to them. Here are two other ways of reducing workplace accidents: selective exclusion and safety training. Selective exclusion involves not hiring people who are at risk for accidents. For instance, older employees tend to have fewer accidents than younger employees. I ask you to explore that this week in the reflection exercise. Think about some of the reasons why this might be the case. There are a variety of reasons, and it all ties back to older employees having more knowledge and more experience. So we might pay attention to age if we can prove that this correlation exists, that older employees at our organization do in fact have fewer accidents than younger employees. We might also pay attention to physical characteristics, physical abilities, if those abilities are related to the job. If a job requires that someone have visual acuity, then it's okay for us to not hire people who don't meet those vision expectations. We can also develop and conduct safety trainings, which are typical in industries with high accident rates. Think about working on an oil rig in the ocean. There is a lot of danger involved in that job, and it would be unheard of not to train individuals in terms of the safety precautions that they need to take. One of the very first things someone in that job would do is learn all the different behaviors, all the different regulations, all the different techniques that they need to put in place every day to make sure that they survive. When it comes to safety, we should use a formal training program and make sure that we evaluate it. Of all the topics that we might focus on in terms of training, safety is one of the easiest to tie back to the organization in terms of impact and results. We also want to make sure that we include supervisors in the design and delivery process. Thankfully, OSHA has training guidelines that can give a lot of employers some ideas in terms of what to include in the training programs, how to conduct the training programs, and how to evaluate it. Here are some of the other ways that we might reduce workplace accidents. Foster high group cohesion. This is because a highly cohesive group that is also safety conscious will spread those behaviors among its members. Safety behavior can be contagious, and so this contagiousness is encouraged in a highly cohesive group. Make sure that the employer-supervisor relationships are of high quality. If employees don't trust their supervisors, for instance, they may not report unsafe behaviors. We can also include very specific information about the reason why certain behaviors are required. When people know the why of a behavior, they're more likely to exhibit it. If adults don't know why you're asking them to do certain things, wear a certain piece of equipment, behave in a certain way, they may not do that behavior simply because they don't understand how important it is. In employee handbooks, we can explain some of the hazards associated with different parts of the job and highlight the specific behaviors that help people avoid those hazards. We also have some evidence that incentive programs can be used to motivate safe behavior. For instance, we might hold a contest between two departments and the winner gets some sort of prize. But we need to be careful about the size of those incentives. Small incentives can change employees' attitudes about safety behaviors, their attitudes. If the incentive is too large, it can actually discourage employees from reporting unsafe behavior. This is because they want the incentive. If they report the unsafe behavior, then their department or the organization doesn't get the incentive. So we have to be careful about the size. If they're too large, we discourage reporting. If they're too small, behaviors don't change.